So between me and my mentees, we've been able to get offers at Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and so on. And the thing is, some of them weren't even CS majors to begin with. And even for myself, I didn't do that well in school academically when I was able to land my Amazon internship and then my Amazon offer. And so what I want to say is that anyone is able to succeed as long as you know how to play the game. And this video, I hope is going to be the ultimate guide to teach you on how to get a software engineering job at these companies. So welcome back to the channel. My name is Justin. I currently work as a full-time software engineer at Amazon. And for the last 2 years, I've been teaching my friends and peers and obviously also myself into getting into these companies. I also have an entire written guide online that you can read for free. It's going to be down in the description, and throughout this video, I will actually also be referring to my guide. But I want to give the goal of this video today, and that is essentially just to make sure that there is a high quality guide on YouTube, the ultimate guide that I want everyone to refer to if they are trying to break into these sort of companies as a software engineer. Because I feel like throughout teaching for the last 2 years, all my friends and peers, that I have really learned how to play the game that they are looking for. So all this is going to be my own personal opinion in this video, but my goal is going to be telling you about what is the interview process like, how to actually study, how to pass the interview and what are they looking for, and even beyond the interview and once you get your job, how to negotiate and all of that. So if you find this video helpful, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, because here on this channel, I make videos about the tech industry, advancing your career, and how to get the edge on life. Now let's talk about who this video is for. This video is going to be for people who are looking for internship, people looking for new grad, people who are looking for L3 Google equivalent roles, or essentially 2 years or less experience in industry. This video can be applicable for people who are looking for that L4 Google equivalent level, which means 2 to 4 year in industry. But the only problem with that is that some companies are going to have a system design interview. But if you want some resources on that, I'll put a link in the description to like essentially a system design primer that I highly recommend to go through. And also there's just a bunch of YouTube channels that already talk about system design questions. I think you can search them up, but this is going to be talking more for those people who are targeting, that L3 level role. And for those who are wondering, if you are applying to these sort of L3 jobs and positions, system design doesn't really come up for you, so that's not something that you need to worry about. And if not clear already, this guide is really going to be focusing on how to get into big tech companies. So companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, or the equivalent. The overview and timestamps of the videos will be down in the description, so feel free to skip to any parts of it. So first, why should you be applying to big companies first and not necessarily smaller companies? In my guide, I have a much more in-depth explanation, but the 3 main reasons are going to be, first, the abilities to actually process applications. So think about it, if you apply to small companies, how many positions are going to be open? Maybe like 5 positions. Versus a large companies, they can have hundreds of positions open, right? And these large companies actually have the ability to process these applications versus a small company. If they get overwhelmed with applications, they just shut down processing. That's why you see people who apply to like hundreds, 200, 500 jobs and never hear back from these small companies, because these small companies just don't have the ability to process the number of applicants that they're getting. The second thing is that these large companies really do reward preparation. They have a very set game that you need to play, and if you play this game, you essentially are able to get in. That's how some of my mentees with no technical background at all, without a CS major, without an internship beforehand, was able to get into companies like Amazon or Google or Microsoft, right? It's because these companies reward preparation, and if you prepare hard enough, if you know how to play their game, you are able to get it. And finally, the third and last thing is going to be money and opportunity cost. Because look, while money is obviously not everything, and your happiness is number one, it is going to pay for your rent, your food, help you pay off your financial debt, and so on, right? And so when you work at a small company and maybe you're earning $80,000 a year, but then you work at a large company earning $160,000 to $220,000 as a new grad software engineer, think about the difference between that, and also how much that difference gets compounded once you take into factor things like investing. So that's why I recommend to try to save some time, try to get into a big tech company first versus going through a bunch of smaller companies, then a large company. But I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I've seen tons of people do that. I'm just saying that this is the way that I've chosen to optimize my route into, these sort of large tech companies. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is going to be hiring funnel. So it is essentially making it very explicitly clear that when you apply, you'll be going into a certain, funnel or a certain, stack of papers, right? So if you're coming from industry, meaning you've already worked for 1 or 2 years, you're going to be put in the industry funnel. If you come as a student, you're going to put in the student funnel. And every funnel, has a certain amount of resources allocated to process that. So if you can get into a more narrow funnel, meaning, less people have the opportunity to apply there, then, you're going to be significantly raising your chances of your application actually getting reviewed. So that's why if you're in industry, I highly recommend to try to get a referral. If possible, it's not necessarily necessary, but it's definitely going to help you, get seen by a recruiter more. Or if you already work in another big tech company, then, you'll already be on top of the stack. For students, I find the referrals almost useless. You have to consider that a referral is usually vouching for someone's work, but if you're a student, you basically have 0 years industry experience, right? So Referrals are not necessary as a student. In fact, me and my mentees have been able to get all of our jobs without referrals at all. I also want to say that for the student funnel, this is the best time to optimize, right? 90% of my mentees who are students were able to get a job because they were in the student funnel. Because these companies know that you're a student and they don't want to catch you in that catch-22 where you need an internship to get an internship, right? These companies understand that and they're going to be a lot more lenient with you as a student. Also later on when we get into the timeline and stuff like that, internships are much easier to get job offers for, and new grads, even though you're still going to be tested almost like a full-time hire, the response rate that you get as a new grad is significantly higher than what you're going to get if you already work in industry for a long time. Okay, so what are some other easy funnels to increase your chances of actually getting hired? The first one is going to be career fair. So obviously this was before COVID, but when you went to a career fair in person, sometimes they would schedule your interview right then and there. In addition, even if they don't necessarily schedule your interview right then and there, at least you can get in contact with a recruiter and you can ask them, hey, when I apply later online, is it okay to contact you later just to follow up on how my application does, right? Usually you're able to, and so when apply, you can tell the recruiter, hey, my name's Justin, I met you at the career fair. I was just wondering if you could check the status of my application and maybe even help me expedite that process. The other way that I recommend is to make sure to follow these recruiters on LinkedIn, because sometimes they'll post, hey, we're looking for 2022 new grads, or hey, we have industry hire positions open. Is anyone interested to apply? Make sure to message me, right? So making sure that you add these recruiters to your LinkedIn network. And also finally, I would look towards large conventions. So especially for female engineers, for example, there's something called GHC or Grace Hopper Convention, which is specifically a convention for female software engineers. And I have friends who have specifically gone through this process who have been literally able to schedule or do the interview right then and there at GHC. And I highly recommend, if you are a female engineer, to take advantage of this opportunity. Just to note though, I do not recommend to do the virtual GHC, which has started through the COVID pandemic. I've heard that is really a horrible experience. I do not recommend it at all. And also, GHC does cost money. And if that is not something financially viable for you, there are companies like Google and other companies, or even your school, who is willing to sponsor you to go to GHC. So finally, when you apply, think about the funnels, right? Think about the funnels that you apply to. And I will say, you don't necessarily need to stress too much about this. I literally just applied normally, just through the normal job portals, and I've gotten offers at the top companies. But I'm just saying, if you do happen to get into a more narrow funnel, it can be the edge between getting the job and not getting the job. Okay, so the next part that I want to talk about is going to be the interview process. So it's essentially going to be split into 3 parts. It's going to be the online assessment or OA, the phone interview, and then the on-site. Also, I want to quickly clarify some vocabulary that I'll be using here in the future, which is going to be technical interviews. When I say technical interviews, I'm essentially referring to algorithmic-like questions. So questions that are similar to the types that you'll find on MeCode.com, which is essentially going to be coding-based questions to test your algorithmic skills and to test your usage of data structures and algorithms. So the very first thing is going to be the online assessment. So usually this is going to consist of 2 to 4 questions for the online assessment, and you're going to be given limited time to do this. The time really depends per company, and the goal of the online assessment is not necessarily to be perfect, right? So they actually have something called like a green band or yellow band. So as long as you do moderately okay, you are actually able to just pass through the on-site interview onto the next stage called the phone interview. I also want to note that some companies might also just have you skip the online assessment and go straight to the phone interview. And also that every section is independent of each other. So, even if you do amazing in the online assessment, but you end up doing, terribly on the phone interview, right? Your on-site assessment is not going to somehow raise your phone interview score, right? All of these sections are independent. Okay, so then onto the phone interview, it is essentially going to be a live technical round. So essentially you're going to get an algorithmic question. You're going to have a real interviewer there to test you live. And they're really going to test, how well you communicate, problem solve, and code. And this is essentially just, like a live human to screen you further to make sure, that the online assessment wasn't a fluke, and that, that you actually are, a decent interviewer that's worth the time to put you onto the on-site. Okay, so now let's say you pass the phone interview, now you're onto the on-site. And so for interns, it is actually significantly easier. You're going to have 1 to 3 rounds, right? So for example, companies like Amazon is going to have, directly from the online assessment directly to 1 on-site round. Companies like Facebook are going to have 1 round for phone screening and then 2 rounds for on-site. So if you have the opportunity for internship, and later I'm actually going to talk about timelines about internship, make sure you take advantage of that. Now, if you're new grad or full-time, the number of rounds that you should be expecting is 3 to 5 rounds. So it is going to be significantly longer. If you're an intern, you should expect almost all technical rounds. Maybe they sometimes throw in a bit of behavioral in the mix of all that, but you should expect all technical rounds. If you're new grad or full-time, out of the 3 to 5 rounds, 1 of them will usually be behavioral, while the rest of them is going to be all technical. And so hopefully you guys begin to see a pattern here that the technical interview is really dominating this whole process. That's why, later on in this video, I'm going to go much more in depth about the process and the timeline and the preparation steps and all that. So now let's jump onto the timeline of how to apply, when to apply, etc. And this is going to be much more applicable for students. Really for industry, you can apply whenever you like, but for students and new grads, there really is a timeline that you need to be aware of. And I see so many people make this mistake. So please do not make this mistake, because I've seen a lot of people's opportunities be crushed because of not properly applying when they should have. The first thing that I recommend is to apply between September 1st to September 30th and maybe at latest October 15th, because most companies are going to be processing the applications that come in during this time and then scheduling the online assessments, the phone interviews, and then the on-sites into October, November, and December. If you actually begin applying in November and December, very few companies are going to still be processing applications during this time, and your chances of hearing back is going to be very small. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. I've had lots of mentees, apply in that November sort of range and still hear back, but the number of companies that you'll hear back from is significantly decreased in terms of all the companies you could have heard back if you just applied in September 1st to that September 30th timeline. Now, some companies, like Facebook, like Amazon, they may release their applications earlier, like June or July, but through all the people I've taught and also talking to the recruiters myself, for example, while Facebook may release in June or July, they don't process any applications till September 1st. So even when I've been able to get connected with like a Facebook or Meta recruiter, they told me, hey, reach back to me on September 1st, because that's when we actually start processing the application. And also, while some companies may process early, for example, Amazon actually did release their applications in June and they started interviewing as early as July, do you really want to be doing those interviews in July when you could have the extra time to prepare till September, right? And you don't really need to worry about, headcounts or things like that, because, as long as you apply in that September sort of range, they're going to have all the headcounts in the world. These companies interview all the way through January to February, right? It's more about getting your application in on time, and as long as it's in time, again, throughout the September 1st to September 30th range, right? You're going to have more than enough time to prepare, and you're still going to be on track. And so again, the biggest mistake I've seen people make, and I cannot stress this enough, is that people feel so scared. They're like, I'm gonna apply in November or December. They don't even think about applying until after the finals or everything is over, and it's too late by then, right? These companies do not release the applications during the spring semester. During that January to June sort of range, these companies aren't really going to be having any application out during that time. Even if they're out, they're not necessarily processing those applications, right? So at least for large, big tech companies, make sure you get it out during the September 1st to September 30th range. Now, there are going to be some exceptions. Let's go over those. The first one's going to be Robinhood. I do find if you are interested in Robinhood, apply between that July to August sort of date. They fill up really fast, actually. And so I really recommend, as soon as Robinhood come out, try to apply to them. The other thing is also for banking or large hedge funds, I also highly recommend to apply between actually that mid-August to September 10th sort of period, because these companies actually will release their applications early, in sort of that late August period, and they try to wrap up, from my own experience, this is my personal observation through my mentees and myself, that they try to wrap up by the end of September, maybe latest mid-October, right? I have seen 1 or 2 exceptions, but really once you miss that date of applying in late August to early September, really these large banking companies, you lose the opportunity. And companies like JP Morgan, for example, it's actually significantly easier to get into JP Morgan. They require much less technical preparation. In fact, their on-site doesn't even test technical questions. It's actually much more behavioral or, talking about your resume sort of thing. And so I highly recommend, like getting a company like JP Morgan, is a lot easier to pass through. Other companies like Goldman Sachs and Capital One, the timeline still applies, but their on-site actually is a real on-site. They actually do testing on your technical knowledge. But these large banking companies, there's still a good opportunity as a foot in the door if you end up not getting into these large FANG companies. The other thing I want to say is, obviously you can only apply to these companies as a US citizen, just because most of these companies usually don't do sponsorship. And also that if you are, happen to be a US citizen, that you should try to apply for JP Morgan's hackathon called Code for Good. Essentially, it also releases during that late August period. And if you can get into the hackathon, essentially, if you do the hackathon, even with no technical skill set beforehand, right? If you work hard during the hackathon and you get something else with your team, 80% of the people there, get an offer extended out to them. It's actually pretty amazing. When I worked at JP Morgan and I was meeting all the other people who was interning with me, they were like, yeah, I just came from this hackathon. And I actually took advantage of that. And I taught my future mentees, to do this hackathon. And I've actually also had a few of them land their, internship offers with JP Morgan because of that. Okay, so now onto the resume portion. I highly recommend to just read my written guide if you've already been working in industry and all you need to know is what's a good template to use and how to write good bullet points. My written guide will have that all. what I want this video section to be is going to be for those people who don't have anything on your resume, who may not have as much technical experience at all. So the first thing that I'm going to say is get something on your resume, right? The really nice thing about tech is that you can do projects to prove yourself. It's not like business or finance where you need internship experience to prove yourself. In tech, you just build something, and that's how you're going to get projects on your resume, and you can just put your projects at the very top. That's what I did when I didn't have any experience, and that's going to stand out a lot more. How to actually choose these projects, I have a list of resources on my written guide on the type of courses you do, but I highly recommend to just go to Udemy, right? Choose like a course to do, and make sure the course has projects that you can follow along with and later adapt. And that's how you're going to get something on your resume and actually begin to learn some practical skills. The thing that I am going to say about this though is that you will obviously going to need more practical skills than just blowing through a course in 2 weeks to 4 weeks, right? Get it on your resume, and then when you get the offer, go back, review it more, and continue to pick up practical skills. And also that when you go through the course and when you then eventually adapt the project for your own resume, make sure you understand the what, the how, the why, and the trade-offs of the project, right? You don't need to build the next Uber, the next Twitter, right? You don't need to build a Facebook clone. What you need to do is understand the trade-offs and implications of why you've built the project, because really understanding that, it's going to stand out to your interviewer when they ask you about your project. But if you do end up in a situation where you need to choose between doing more projects or preparing for your algorithms, right? Just get the projects done and put much more of your time in algorithms. That's going to be much more important if you really do come down to that scenario. So on to how to prepare for the algorithm interview. The very first thing is what language should you use? I highly recommend Python, okay? Personally for me at work, I use JavaScript, right? But the reason why I recommend Python is because it has a lot of feature-specific things that make it really optimal for coding. It's very much like a pseudocode. And so if you use Python, it's going to be very easy to go through the interview and not worry about, syntax or typecasting as much. And also, just most of the solutions and things that you're going to find online is mainly written in Java or Python. So I highly recommend use Python. The other reason why is there's a tool called livepythontutor.com. So I highly recommend this tool because essentially you can throw Python snippets into the website and you can step through every single solution. And so I found this very helpful when I was trying to study for my interviews. I saw a solution, I'm like, I don't necessarily understand how this works. I was able to throw it in and step through it step by step, right? And so that's why I recommend to use Python. The second thing is going to be that if you're completely new and if you have no clue, some of the things that I've been talking about, like time and space complexity, what's a queue, what's a stack, what's depth first search or breadth first search, I highly recommend to go on Udemy and pick up a basic data structures and algorithms sort of course for Python. In my guide, I have some recommended ones that you can read about. And again, I have that section for how to get a cheap Udemy course. Go through that sort of course first, and then after that you can do deeper interview preparation. Because if you don't have basic data structures and algorithm skills, then it just doesn't make sense to do deeper preparation until you gain that sort of like knowledge and skill set that more people in industry or people who have gone through college is going to have. Okay, so then on to the next thing. For those of you who do have more data structures and algorithms, if you are aware of things like time and space complexity, then I just want to say, first of all, do not just do pure leet code, okay? And this is my opinion. There are people who just do this, but I think doing pure leet code is really, really dumb, okay? And this is why I say it. To me, it's like if you were trying to learn calculus by doing 1,000 calculus problems, right? That is pretty inefficient. Why didn't you read the chapter about derivative and then integral first before doing the practice problems, right? So what I'm going to recommend is to use something called Grokking Decoding Interview. And again, on my written guide, I have a whole section on how to get Grokking for cheap. You can essentially pick it up for about 40 bucks. And the reason why I'm going to recommend Grokking is because it goes over patterns that you can utilize through like 80% of your interviews, right? And in my guide, in the recommended timeline, I talk about these specific chapters and the specific problems that you can do in Grokking in the order that I recommend if you want to get the bang for your buck in terms of time invested. And so, really through Grokking, this is how, you build a very strong foundation. And this is how I've taught, my past 20 mentees into getting into these top tech companies. It is mainly through Grokking. I'm not saying that LeetCode does not have its place. In fact, I think LeetCode is a great resource, but it doesn't make sense to start off with LeetCode. I also find that, if you've already done some data structures and algorithms, but you're still struggling with Grokking, I also find that Algo Expert is a great resource. And again, I have an entire section on my guide on how to get Algo Expert for cheap, but essentially you can also pick it up using my trick, getting it between 45 to 50 bucks. And I find that, a lot of people like going through Algo Expert first because the video explanations are a bit more clear to them versus, Grokking is a bit more text driven, a lot more, reading heavy, right? And so I find that some of my mentees who are more in that, beginner intermediate stage, they enjoy doing Algo Expert alongside Grokking more because it broke it down a lot easier for them to understand. you end up finishing grokking, or if you want to do this instead of algo expert on the side, I also highly recommend to do blind 75, which is essentially, these top 75 legal questions that the community has gathered, which they find the most applicable across all interviews for all these different companies. So personally, I recommend do this after grokking, and I also wanted to give a shout out to one of the channels called NeetCode, so NEETCODE. He has an entire playlist on all the solutions for every single question on this blind 75 lead code list. So the very nice thing is, as you go through the blind 75 list, rather than just reading the forum, or maybe it doesn't have a solution, you can watch a video explanation. I really tried really hard to make sure that I can get the resources to you guys for cheap. And so, if you buy all the resources that I recommend, you're probably going to be spending about like 40 to like $100, right? It's a large amount of money, but it's not necessarily like make or break the bank, right? And it's actually much better than when I went through the interview process. I probably spent like $2,000 trying to get all these different resources, trying to understand the process, right? I really tried my best to make these resources cheap and easily accessible for you guys. So, again, if you like the things I'm putting out there and giving you all these tips on how to get these resources for cheap, hit that like button. What are some basic things that I want to tell you as you're studying through algorithms? Recommend when you go through this process to study with a friend, because you're going to go insane and you're going to need a friend to help keep you accountable through this entire process. Second thing I'm going to say is make sure you set up days to review. So after the first day that you learn something, you usually forget about 50% of it, right? So if you go through, like one chapter for grokking and then, the second chapter for grokking, set aside some days to go back and review. And so the way that I do it personally is when I was going through grokking, every 2 or 4 chapters or, patterns essentially, right? I will go back and review those 2 and 4 patterns by doing the first challenge problem per section, just to make sure that I still understand how to apply the pattern. And if I didn't, I would spend that day, reviewing that chapter. If you want more details about how to do this, you can look into something called spaced repetition. That's essentially the idea that I implemented here, because it is going to be hard as you go through things on how to remember it, right? And you're not expected to remember everything, but you're more expected on knowing how to rediscover the solution. And so that's going to require review and repeating things over and over again until you can sort of derive the solution again. The next thing I want to say is that ultimately everything that I say, adapt it to your own habits and adapt it to the way that you learn, right? So the way that I'm advising is not necessarily going to be set in stone, right? Feel free to do the thing that you feel best to do, and feel free to meander, right? Because every resource is going to have its own way of looking at things, and feel free to utilize different resources if you really feel like it. This is just the way that I've been able to optimize with the people that I teach. And finally, the last thing is that this is going to be a mental battle. So if you have the ability to, right, give yourself some time to prepare. I highly recommend about 3 to 6 months of preparation. For example, if you're preparing for that September sort of timeline and that date, take the summer to prepare and get ready, right? Or if you have time, really take 6 months to prepare versus the 3 months of summer. Really, if you are going to be studying for 3 months, I highly recommend to study, like 4 to 5 days a week, at least 2 to 4 hours a day, right? It's a really intensive process. So if you have the opportunity to spread this time out more, if you can get that to 4 months or 5 months or 6 months, right? It's really going to reduce the mental burden that you have. I also recommend that if you have things like school or work or family commitment, right? Make sure that you're balancing all of this. And if you have the opportunity to pull back from some of that. So I have some of my mentees who are overachievers and they like, overburdening themselves with schoolwork. And I had to tell them, wait a minute, please reduce your course load for next semester, because it doesn't make sense if you are in the process of interviewing to be going through this many classes, right? And so, again, make sure that you take care of yourself. This is really going to be a long mental battle, and make sure that you're essentially able to balance all of this. Okay, so on to the next section on how to actually pass your live technical interviews. So first of all, I highly recommend you guys watch a channel called Clem on YouTube. I'll put his link down in the description. But essentially, he's an ex-Google, ex-Facebook software engineer, and also he's the person and founder of Algo Expert. And so he actually reveals, like during the interview, how your interviewers actually grade you. And they essentially grade you on 3 main things, right? They're going to grade you on a 1 to 4 scale for communication, problem solving, and coding abilities. And so to best maximize your chances, I recommend to use something like my coding template, which again, I'll put down in the description, in order to stay consistent during your interview and maximize your chances for success. Not necessarily saying you need to use this, but this is what I found consistent for me and my mentees. Okay, so let's go through like a basic question using my coding template, and let's see how this turns out into the evaluation criteria that Clem talks about. So let's say you're given a question like, remove all the duplicates from this array, right? So the very first thing in my coding template is going to be, make sure you ask questions. You want to make sure you scope out the question. So first of all, is the input going to be an input of integers or an input of strings and integers, right? So, that's a very good question to ask. Is the output going to be an array with all the duplicates removed, or, like with all the duplicates removed, does this need to be in place? So do I need to modify the original array, or can I create a new array? And also I might ask questions like, what do I do if the array is empty? Do I just return an empty array? Do I return true or false? Things like this, right? So it's essentially scoping out the question and, verifying the constraints. The second thing is now, you give a test case. So, give back an example, right? To make sure that you confirm and understand the question. So the worst thing to do is you go through the whole question and you find out that you've been understanding the question wrong, right? So, I might say something like, okay, given an array of like 1, 1, 2, do I return like an array of just 1 and 2? And after I get my test cases, I like to break it down as a human being. So don't say, oh, I'm going to use a for loop, a hash map, a set, things like that. Just say it in a very human-like manner and explain it in a very easy way. The problem is that I see a lot of people just jump straight into the technical solution. And if you jump straight into the technical solution, sometimes your interviewer will lose you and they don't necessarily know, hey, is the solution right until you finish writing it out, right? So make sure that you start talking about the human intuitive approach is the way that I like to describe it. So I might say something like, yeah, so in real life, if I was given like a list of numbers, right, and I had to figure out the duplicates, the way that I would go about it is that as I scan through this list, I'm gonna write down the numbers that I've seen. And if I've already previously seen a number, then I won't, include it in my new list, right? And then the interviewer might say, yep, that looks good, or what about this? Did you consider this? And then now that I have that done, I'm going to give my initial time and space complexity. So I'm going to say, yeah, so the time that it's going to take is it's going to be linear. It's going to take linear time, linear space. Again, if you don't know when I talk about time and space complexity, go watch an introduction, data structures, and algorithm video. And then finally, I'm going to get to the actual coding part and then, actually translate my human thought into code where I write a for loop, check things against a hash map or set, and then, add it to my answer array. And then, finally get my time and space complexity after I write out the code if it happens to change. Maybe my initial time and space complexity analysis was wrong. If we look back on the evaluation, right, let's go over the 3 things. 1, communication. Does this person communicate well? Yes, obviously he or she does, right? He wrote out a very nice structure explaining every step on how he approached it, right? Does he have good problem solving abilities? Yes, because during his human intuitive approach, right, he broke down the problem very well and he was able to explain it well in a very human intuitive manner. And then finally, does he show good coding ability? And in this case, this is just practice, but essentially you need to be good at translating your thoughts into code, and that's how they evaluate you on, and they just check your fluency with a coding language. Quick tip that I want to give is that during your actual coding phase of the interview, feel free to use comments or pseudocode as you go, right? So oftentimes when I'm going through the actual interview process, I might say something like, I'm just going to leave a comment here, saying this, or I'm just going to assume I have a pseudo function to check the out of bound condition, and I'll get back to this at the end, right? And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm trying to get to the core logic first and not necessarily get caught up in like small things like out of bound conditions, right? I want to make sure I get to the core logic of the algorithm, and then I know I can always retrace my step and come back to it if the interviewer asks me to. Okay, so on to the next step is going to be the behavioral interview. And so, this is going to be a bunch of, fast summarizing tips, but I actually have a whole video on this already. So, I'm essentially going to replicate what I said in that video here, but it is essentially first, make sure that you know how to introduce yourself, right? Make sure that, you're smelling, make sure your posture's nice, make sure that you're keeping a good voice, make sure you're not using a lot of ums and likes, because that's going to detract from the way that you're speaking. And, ultimately we're all human, so the way that you present yourself does matter. The thing is, when they ask you to introduce yourself, make sure that you have a story ready about who you are, what your skill set, right? And how did you get here? So I usually like to say something like, yeah, my name's Justin. I recently graduated from NYU and I do full stack web development. And the way that I got into it is that I actually used to be a writer, but then I realized I had imposter syndrome, when I came to college. And so I really spent the last 3 years teaching myself full stack web development and learning skills like React and Vue, Node.js, backend, NoSQL and SQL databases. What I recommend is to make sure that you abstract behavioral questions out. So don't just remember every single behavioral question, but rather abstract it a level further. So for example, they ask you something like, how would you deal with conflict from a team member, right? Or how would you deal with conflict from a manager? Or how would you deal with conflict from a customer, right? All of these questions are really just asking, how do you deal with conflict? So instead of, coming up with an answer individually for all 3 of those, just come up with one big answer. So an example like this might be, anytime I get a conflict resolution question, I usually say it in 3 main bullet points. And I highly recommend to use this 3 bullet point structure because it's going to keep you succinct and moving on. So onto my answer. Yeah, so if I ever had to deal with conflict, there are 3 main steps that I would take to approach it. The first one is I'll be empathetic and understand that we want what's best for the team, right? So maybe me, my manager, the customer, whatever, right, are looking at this from 2 different perspectives. And, I will be empathetic with wherever they are coming from, right? And understand the situation that they're in, and maybe understand, maybe they have a different value on like how to approach this problem. I will work out a compromise with them. Make sure that, maybe they are correct, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, and maybe they're wrong, right? Or maybe it's a mix in between, but I will make sure that we compromise and figure out a solution. And finally, the last thing is I want to make sure that I actually follow through with whatever the compromise is. So, I want to make sure that we don't just say something, but we actually follow through. And so, now if someone, is taking notes of your behavioral interview, it's very easy for them to follow along. They just write down, be empathetic, compromise, follow through, right? And now that we're done with talking about the interview process, how to study, how to prepare, what resources to use, now let's talk about post-interview and what happens if you actually get the offer. After you get the offer, you're going to get a compensation package that consists of 3 main parts. It's going to consist of your base salary, which is just straight up salary, RSUs or stocks, and then your signing bonus. Essentially, the way that you're going to calculate your total compensation is going to be on an average of 4 years. So you're going to do your base salary plus your stock divided by 4 plus your signing divided by 4. Now, you can do the calculations in multiple different ways. Maybe you only do the signing divided by 2 because most people promote within 2 years. So, that's not necessarily something for you to worry about, after the 2 years, because your salary will rise by, another 15 to 20%. Also, when you're doing your total compensation, I also highly recommend to do it just at the straight cash value instead of factoring in things like stock growth and things like that, right? So usually when you get an offer, it's going to be something like, oh, you're going to have $120,000 in base, $100,000 in stock, and maybe like $50,000 in signing. I would just take the stock at face value. I wouldn't factor in things like growth. I will give a small preface and warning that if a stock is doing badly when you join a company, right, maybe do depreciate the stock value a bit. I also think that the other thing that I want to note is that if you can, try to generally get more base or more stock, because if you get more signing, the signing actually is taxed at about another 10% higher than your usual income. I also highly recommend to always negotiate, right? Even if they say it's not negotiable, always try to push first, right? Now, for interns and new grads, you can't really negotiate for interns. For new grads, it kind of depends. Some companies do have the wiggle room for that, but always push if you're in that new grad or full-time industry position to negotiate. I'm actually going to refer to Meiko's video and Colors of Chloe video. They have great videos all about negotiation, and I'll put that in the description. They have amazing tips, and I highly recommend to check them out. The one thing I want to say is don't be scared of negotiating. I have a lot of mentees and friends who are scared of negotiating because they think the offer is going to be pulled back. That's not going to happen, right? They've invested thousands of dollars and man-hour into you to extend that offer, right? For every single person that gets an offer, like 20 to 30 to 50 people got rejected, right? So you want to make sure that you understand that this company has as much writing on you as you do on them, right? And that you are ultimately selling your time and your service to the company. Now, let's say you get the offer, you accept the package, you finish negotiating all that, make sure that you actually invest, right? So make sure you invest in the S&P 500, QQQ, a Vanguard ETF, right? Because if you don't invest your money, you're essentially putting free 10 to 20% growth on the table every single year that you don't invest. And that you're never going to get rich from just, your basic salary, right? You want to make sure that you're investing in stocks for the long term, because in 10, 15, 20 years, that money can turn into like $1 million or $2 million. And finally, it's going to be that if you don't get an offer, it's okay. Everyone always has their different paths that they're going to take, and I've had mentees and people I've taught who have taken 2 years out of graduating school, or 2 years in industry before they end up getting Amazon or Apple or Google or Microsoft or whatever, right? And actually, even if it takes a bit more time, you having a bit more of that experience, you're going to get a larger negotiation band, meaning that when you come in, you can get way more money, especially if you're ready to negotiate, than if you were to just come in as a new grad or a junior engineer, or maybe just earlier on in your career. This is going to be a very stressful process, so make sure to take care of yourself through all of this. Anyways, that's it. I already can tell that this is going to be a long video. If you watched this whole video or you just skipped around, I really hope that you enjoyed it. Again, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. I highly recommend to join my Discord. I'm usually very responsive on Discord. I love to answer questions. I'll see y'all next time, and bye-bye.